Today, I want to talk about the 4 earliest civilizations in the Old World. Let's begin by reviewing what is a civilization. It is a state-level society with the following characteristics: a stratified hierarchical society, food and labor surplus controlled by the elite, dense population centers, in other words, cities or urban centers, control of a territory, a formal government and a military force, specialization of labor, monumental public architecture, and a system of record keeping. The earliest civilizations arose in the Old World. I'll talk about the Sumerian, the Harappan and Egyptian civilizations, and end by talking about the Shang. The oldest civilization in the world was the Sumerian civilization, started by 4500 before the Christian era in present-day Iraq and Syria in the area called Mesopotamia. This is where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers flow side by side. We find social stratification, which is reflected in their hierarchical settlement pattern of city-states with cities, villages, and hamlets. Sumerian civilization was the first to divide time into 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute, and to divide day and night into 12-hour periods. They had the first schools, monumental architecture, irrigation works, and government bureaucracy. The first writing, and they were the first to tell the story of the Great Flood, the Ark, and the pairs of animals, as well as other narratives that show up in the Bible. The city of Uruk at 4500 before the Common Era was the first city in the world. It covered 1 square mile, and it had a 6-mile-long encircling wall enclosing over 20,000 people. This urban center was dominated by 2 large compounds, a public and economic compound surrounded by a wall, and a religious temple complex. Later, temples became ziggurats, that is, a temple on top of a massive human-built mud brick platform. Now, why do they call them mud bricks? Well, it's because in this part of the world there aren't many trees and you cannot afford to bake your bricks. So these were simply sun-dried squares of clay, in other words, mud bricks. It's estimated that it took 7 million bricks to make the ziggurat at Ur. And ziggurats are examples of monumental architecture. The earliest writing is found in the Sumerian civilization by 3000 before the Common Era, and it's called cuneiform. It was used to keep records initially, and it was found on tablets as well as cylinder seals. Cylinder seals were used to mark personal property or to sign documents, and they were also worn around the neck. You note that the seal itself is a cylinder shape with a hole down the center, so you could string it around your neck or attach it to your clothing, and then you would roll it out onto clay, which would dry to seal something. But then cuneiform was used to record oral narratives, love poems, and great epics, such as the many stories of Gilgamesh. Parts of the Bible were taken from cuneiform texts. And cuneiform writing was used for a number of different languages up until after 100 before the Common Era. Who was Gilgamesh? Well, he was a semi-mythic king of Uruk in the 26th century before the Common Era, and he's known from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Apparently, many oral stories circulated about Gilgamesh, and 700 to 1,000 years after his reign, they were written down in cuneiform. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great king Gilgamesh is thought to be too proud and arrogant by the gods, and so they decide to teach him a lesson by sending the wild man, Enkidu, to humble him. And after a fierce battle, Gilgamesh defeats Enkidu, and the two become best friends and embark on adventures together. During one adventure, however, Enkidu is killed, and Gilgamesh is stricken with grief. He sets out on a quest to find the meaning of life, and in the end, he fails in 2 tasks set that would have won him immortality. Mesopotamia contained many independent walled states. But about 2234 before the Common Era, Sargon of Akkad conquered other city-states and unified Mesopotamia. One major change then was the legitimization of kingship through military conquests. Earlier, the king had had power through divine authority. We find craft specialization. Some crafts were produced in the domestic household, but some were produced under strict control at palace and temple workshops. There were wood and ivory workers, goldsmiths and silversmiths, creating art like you see pictured here, stoneworkers, carpenters, leather workers, rope makers, workers in reed, wool, and flax textile making. And the development of the pottery wheel led to mass-produced pottery. Sumerians had extensive trade networks, including with the Harappan Civilization in the Indus Valley of Pakistan and India, and they even set up trading colonies in foreign states. So let's talk about the Indus or Harappan Civilization, which was present by 3500 before the Common Era. It's found along the Indus River, mostly in Pakistan and over into India, down into the Rann of Kutch, just past the state of Gujarat in India. Unlike other civilizations, no record was passed down about this civilization, so it was a surprise to discover an ancient civilization that no one knew about, entirely through archaeology. I was lucky enough to spend 3 seasons working in Gujarat on Harappan era sites. The Harappan civilization controlled an area of nearly 500 square miles, or over twice the size of either Egypt or Mesopotamia. The state was based on river-fed agriculture and cattle pastoralism. It had large populations, large, well-planned cities and smaller towns, monumental architecture, specialists, long-distance trade, and a written language. It was a stratified hierarchical society. The population overwhelmingly did rural farming and herding. But we also find artisans, merchants, architects, scribes, bureaucrats, and rulers. At the bottom of society were slaves, mentioned in Mesopotamia texts as items of trade. We find no evidence of military aggression and little evidence of ritual. No large temples, no clear small temples, gods, or priests. However, water was clearly an important element. They did not seem to have a hereditary monarchy, and perhaps they were ruled by councils of leaders. They did have craft specialization, and we find a wide range of objects, as well as various workshop areas in cities and in outposts. Potters, bead makers, metalsmiths, jewelers, stoneworkers, weavers, basket makers, bangle makers, and seal makers. We find a high degree of standardization across the Harappan civilization in building techniques, in brick making, and the size of the bricks, the system of weights and measures, and the settlement pattern, with some regional differences in things like local pottery styles. One of the 5 largest cities was Mohenjo-Daro in present-day Pakistan. This urban city had gridded streets, a sewer system, apartments, walls, and fortification. Here's an aerial view of the excavations, early excavations at Mohenjo-Daro, and an artist's reconstruction of how the city would have looked. In Harappan civilizations, cities are usually nearly 200 miles apart, and each is surrounded by farmland, and they're built on mud brick platforms surrounded by brick walls. So again, unfired mud brick, which tends to crumble, and so these would build up as hills through time. Here you see partially excavated residences or the bases of the buildings, and on the left a computer-generated reconstruction. One difference between this computer-generated reconstruction and what the archaeologists think, they believe that these buildings were only 2 stories tall, and there would have been windows only on the 2nd story. Houses had inside toilets and baths that drained into a public sewer system. Here, for example, is a bath inside of a house, and on the far side you can see the drain leading out to the sewer system in the street. Sewers down the middle of the street were covered. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro was a large tank that was waterproofed with bitumen, or natural tar. And it's another example of monumental architecture. So it had a building over it, and it's thought that here's where people would come for ritual bathing prior to ceremonies. The Harappan Civilization people used standardized weights and scales to measure grain and other goods. We find toys, such as this terracotta model of a bullock cart, which looks very similar to modern-day bullock carts. The Harappan script has been found on many seals. Seals were stamps used to seal bags of grain or other items. We can't yet read it. Why? Well, for one, we never found a Rosetta Stone like the stone with 3 different languages that helped us interpret hieroglyphics. It has been found on over 3,700 objects, and we found 400 to 450 different signs. But the writing is mostly on small stone stamped seals, and the average inscription length is only 5 signs, and the longest inscription we have is 23 signs. So no wonder we can't read it yet. So if they had longer texts, they were on less sturdy objects, so maybe on wood or on some form of paper that hasn't been preserved, but the writing that's on stone is very short. And there's controversy over what language it might represent, perhaps Dravidian. It is written from right to left, and it appears to be a logosyllabic script composed of logograms or ideograms, used both as logograms and syllables. The 5 most common terminal signs used are these. The Harappan civilization had an extensive trade network, including with Mesopotamia, that is, with the Sumerians. They got copper from Baluchistan to the west and Rajistan to the east, carnelian and agate from Gujarat, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, where they also had a colony. Sumerian texts from Mesopotamia refer to Indus merchants supplying Mesopotamia with ivory, gold, carnelian, hardwoods, rare animals, and slaves. And Sargon of Akkad mentions ships coming from the Indus civilization. Let's talk very briefly about the Egyptian civilization, which had dynasties by 3100 before the Common Era. Most people lived in rural communities, but they also began building towns with administrative buildings and palaces. And this settlement pattern was linear up and down the river, because as you can see, it's only near the river that you had greenery, and then not far from the river, desert. So the towns and villages were along the Nile, and temples were often placed at the edge of the desert and were connected to the river by canals. The early period is called Predynastic, and we find already specialists in pottery. This predynastic pottery has a distinctive black-top redware jars formed by hand and produced between 5,000 to 3,000 before the Common Era. Before the pot was fired, it was burnished with a smooth pebble. That is, it was polished. And immediately after firing, the upper part of the vessel was placed in organic material, which resulted in the blackened rims that characterize this type of pottery. But many other specialties developed, and craft traditions appear to have been passed down through a family. Most specialists worked for royal or temple workshops, producing items for prestige and ritual use, and some used teamwork and assembly line production. They established long-distance trade networks, and they also sent out trading parties. Prior to the invention of artificial mummification, pre-dynastic Egyptians buried their dead in shallow pits in the sand, and these burials produced a kind of natural mummification in which the bodies became desiccated naturally in the dry sand. And the deceased individuals are usually buried in a contracted position that may have imitated sleep. We find evidence for belief in an afterlife because they buried them with grave goods such as pottery and stone vessels, slate pallets for grinding pigments, hairpins, and flint knives. The earliest tombs were called mastabas. These had a rectangular above-ground structure made of mud brick and stone, and inside was a shaft that took you down into the earth to a burial chamber underground. They looked like this on the surface. Later on, they began to build pyramids, and the first pyramid, dating to 2650 before the Common Era at Saqqara, was what's called a step pyramid, which looked like mastabas piled on top of each other. When it was used, it was covered in white limestone. Pyramids are a monumental architecture. The writing system used hieroglyphs, which consist of logograms or words, phonograms or sounds, and determinatives. Initially, they used over 1,000 signs and later reduced them to 750. At the same time, they developed a cursive, simpler script for the scribes called hieratic, and it was written from right to left. And then they also produced a yet simpler script called demotic. The earliest paper-like material was made by the Egyptians from papyrus, a plant that grows in wet spots. You take the stem, strip out the pith, and lay these strips of pith at right angles on top of each other and glue them together. So it's not a real paper, it's papyrus. The oldest recovered papyrus dates to 2500 before the Common Era, but older stone inscriptions portray scribes with rolls of papyrus. Let's end by mentioning the Shang dynasty in China, which began by 1600 before the Common Era. It was one of several regional states that emerged during the Chinese Bronze Age. These regional states had competition and warfare among them. They had clearly urban sites with residential, industrial, elite areas, and cemeteries. They had large temples or palaces, and specialists who worked in bronze, pottery, or bone working. They had differential burial modes, including royal tombs with sacrifices. Writing developed through the use of oracle bones. And they domesticated animals and had agricultural crops. To summarize, civilizations arose in numerous places in the Old World. The earliest was the Sumerian civilization in Mesopotamia, or present-day Iraq and Syria, that arose by 4500 before the Common Era. The Indus or Harappan Civilization arose along the Indus River in present-day Pakistan and India by 3500 before the Common Era. And the Egyptian arose along the Nile River in northeastern Africa by 3100 before the Common Era. and the Shang dynasty in China by 1600 before the Common Era, and others that I have not mentioned. Today, we concentrated on the earliest 4 Old World civilizations. But we also find civilizations or state-level societies in the New World, and in particular in Mesoamerica and South America. And in my next talk, I will talk about the Mesoamerican early civilizations.